Hello, everyone. We're back for another discussion. Aaron here, Nevada Council on Problem Gambling, talking again with Ted. Ted, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
I want to talk about kind of the what is problem gambling. What is problem gambling? What is social gambling? And possibly just the what is the definition of gambling? But if you don't mind starting with introducing yourself and some of your credentials, please.
Absolutely. Maybe I'll start by introducing my associate. This is Benny. So if he comes in and out of the frame occasionally, he's prompting me with some cues. So yes, my name is Ted Hartwell. I'm the community engagement liaison for the Nevada Council on Problem Gambling. By day, I'm principally a research scientist at the Desert Research Institute here in town. I've been on the research faculty there for nearly 30 years. By night, I'm a professional cellist with the Las Vegas Philharmonic, or at least I am once we get out of the COVID-19 situation and we're able to have concerts again. I've been a soccer coach, a volleyball coach locally, but none of those areas of my life kept me from developing a pretty serious gambling disorder that reached a head almost 13 years ago. And as I got into recovery from that gambling disorder, I became very interested in the idea of public advocacy and education on this issue. There didn't seem to be a whole lot of public faces talking about this issue in the way that we have celebrities or elite athletes or even past presidents that have alluded to their struggles with substances. In the problem gambling realm, we just haven't achieved that level, I think, of societal exposure, if you will. So as I became interested in that, I met Carol O'Hare, the executive director of the Nevada Council on Problem Gambling, who very quickly took me under her arm, and I've been advocating in some way, shape, or form for the council for probably a little over 10 years now.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Well, I guess let's just get right into it. If you could start with, what is the definition of gambling?
Okay, great question, a great place to start. So the definition that I like is basically wagering something of value in order to try and win something of greater perceived value where the outcome is uncertain, whether based on chance or skill or a combination of the two. So if you think about it, that includes not only casino type gambling, which is where most of our minds go here in Nevada when we think about gambling, but it can also include things like bingo. It could include raffle tickets, whether it's for a fundraiser you might support or not. It can involve friendly bets between friends on a sporting event, those Super Bowl squares you do in your family every year during the Super Bowl. So it has a pretty wide definition and can include any of those activities as well as others.
Thank you for that. And I would be remiss if I didn't say here at the Nevada Council, we do not take a stance for or against gambling, and we acknowledge that for many it is a fun pastime. With that said, what is social gambling, or more importantly, what's the difference between social gambling and problem gambling?
Great question. And piggybacking on what you already said, we should emphasize that the great majority of people who do choose to gamble can do so recreationally without any long-term negative consequences to themselves or to their families. But for a small percentage of people, it does become a true addictive disorder, and they're the ones that we're going to address today. So the primary differences between the recreational or the social gambler and the problem gambler are that for the recreational gambler, each event is a separate event. They plan to go gambling. They take only what they can afford to lose, whatever income, and the amount is pretty irrelevant. That's all relative to an individual's personal situation. They budget a certain amount of time to play, and when they lose that or they reach that time period, they they stop. They go off with their friends, they engage in a different activity. Each event is a separate event. They're not thinking about the last time they were gambling and a need to try and win back those losses. And that's something that the problem gambler very often does. It's one of the many signs and symptoms for the problem gambler is that they are looking at gambling events as a means to try and win back the losses that they've had in previous gambling events. They've also lost the ability to control either the amounts of time and or money that they spend on gambling, even though it may have been under control for a good portion of their lives, which is very common. They may begin to lie about their gambling activities or the amounts they've lost to family, friends, coworkers. They become very preoccupied with gambling. So even when they're not gambling, they're obsessing a little bit about their next gambling experience, where they're going to get the money to do that, for example. They often will jeopardize significant relationships they have, whether that's with a family member or a job or a career. They often rely on others to fund their gambling, even though it's not presented in a way that the person they're borrowing money from or the entity they're borrowing money from, that this money is going to be used for gambling. But those are several examples of how the problem gambler differs from the recreational gambler.
Well, picking up on the financial aspect off of what you just said, is problem gambling a financial problem? When I'm out in the community, at community events and stuff, sometimes we'll be asked questions like, how much money is too much? And other questions, but a lot of time it's about money.
So financial impact may be the first visible sign that there's an issue related to gambling, but often the problem, the gambling problem arises out of that person using gambling to escape from other pain in their life. And so using gambling basically as a mood stabilizer. I know when I was toward the end of my gambling disorder, that when I was gambling, I was feeling no pain about life whatsoever. So anything good or bad in my life pretty much disappeared when I was in the act of gambling, pushing those buttons on the video poker machine. And so it really was a great escape. And it wasn't until I thought of that I would start, recognizing sort of the additional level of pain I'd caused myself, and somewhat perversely for the person with the addictive disorder, getting back to that activity is one of the ways to ameliorate that additional pain one has caused oneself. You mentioned amounts of money. It's really, again, not about the amount of money. Each person is different according to their own situation. I can tell you $10 stories that are much more heartbreaking than $10 million stories. And I've known people in the recovery community who have lost both those amounts. And in the case of the individual who lost $10, they were supposed to be putting gas in their car to make it to their job the next day. Really didn't have enough money to put food on the table for their own family to begin with, even with the job they did have. And they rationalized, hey, maybe I can put some of this money in the video poker machine at the convenience store and fill up my whole tank, maybe buy a little extra food. And they lost that, of course, and ended up robbing that convenience store. And then they were very quickly in jail without a way to provide for their families at all, just over $10. Typically, you do see an increase in both the amount of time and the amount wagered. So the frequency increases, the amount of money to achieve the desired effect increases, but not always. Some people, for example, might only gamble once a year. But if during that one event they gamble for 72 hours straight without sleeping, their family thinks they're out of town for a conference when they're checked into a property on the strip, they're spending 6 months of paychecks that they really can't afford to lose. There's all sorts of negative consequences going on there. And that's something I really forgot to highlight. I mentioned several different consequences, but one of the important factors in gambling disorder is that there be those growing negative consequences present in that person's life in one or more areas. And despite those growing consequences, the person feels an inability to stop gambling, even though they may be becoming aware of them.
Hearing you talk about kind of the thoughts and what goes on with problem gambling and some of the repercussions, to me it sounds similar, if not exactly like drug and alcohol addiction. But I also notice in the community, some people get kind of hung up on that, about how could you be, addicted to gambling, and we get so associated with substance and alcohol. Could you explain kind of some of the brain activity involved, or how it is very similar?
Absolutely. It's a great question. I think it's one of the reasons we're a little bit behind the curve with regards to problem gambling than where we are with the substance use disorders. I think societally, from an overall understanding, we've pretty much achieved a general knowledge about alcohol, about various opiates, which is where our country is particularly focused these days. We know these are true addictive disorders. They affect ourselves, our friends, our family members. We know there are safe places to go to get treatment, to get well. Again, we've had past current celebrities, elite athletes, even past presidents who may have alluded to their struggles in these areas. But with gambling, we're not there. The research is probably a couple decades behind, but it is that research that has shown that biochemically, even though you are not ingesting a substance, the brain's response to that behavior is essentially identical and almost indistinguishable from a person who has a substance use disorder. So if you look at functional MRI scans of the brain of the person with a crack cocaine use disorder and alcohol use disorder and gambling disorder side by side, pretty much the same areas of the brain are lighting up in response to those activities, even though, again, in the case with gambling, you're not ingesting a substance. So what we call the midbrain, and if you'll, thankfully I don't have to draw a picture for you, but if I can, mention a discussion that I had with my doctor almost 13 years ago when I first got into treatment. And it was Dr. Rob Hunter who founded the Problem Gambling Center here in Las Vegas. And he was very eloquent about his ability to explain science to the general public. And he talked about the brain being divided essentially into three areas. Right here at the front, we've got the prefrontal cortex. It's behind the hardest bone in the skull to protect that. That's where our personality, where poetry and music and rational thinking and individuality lives in our brains. And at the very back, you can even kind of feel it if you push there just above your neck is where our brain stem is. And that's the part of the brain that's controlling all of those things in our body that we don't have to think about consciously. Our breath, the way our muscles are contracting as we move, things like this. And then smack dab in between those things is the midbrain, where there's a structure called the amygdala lives, which is where things like fight and flight and sex and hunger, and this is also where addictive disorders live. And so it gets tangled up with what would ordinarily be kind of survival mechanisms for us. And for the person with the addictive disorder, that activity or that substance almost feels like it becomes something that's necessary to live normally or to feel normally. And it was one of the best descriptions I ever heard. And he said, and when that's happening, that midbrain, it's overwhelming the part of your brain that normally does the rational thinking. So now your midbrain is doing the thinking for you. And it was the first time anybody had told me anything that made sense to me about my addictive disorder. I thought I must be the world's biggest jerk. I thought I must subconsciously want out of my marriage or something. Nothing made sense, even to me while I was in it, that I would be hurting people I cared about most in the world through this activity and yet being unable to stop. So that's a little bit of a long-winded answer to your question, but it was important to me when I first heard it, so I hope it'll be important to some others who listen to this.
Yeah, no, it makes sense, and a great visual and connecting the dots on that. Just in case anybody's watching this and hearing this discussion and wondering about themselves or their activity or how it makes them feel, how is treatment for problem gambling? What are the options, and is it a treatable disorder?
Well, I'll start with your last question. It's very treatable. So just as there are many treatment possibilities with substance use disorders, we have many treatment options for problem gambling, especially in the state of Nevada, where we do have a problem gambling fund that funds not only educational outreach and awareness and prevention, but also helps fund treatment in the case of many of our providers. So treatment is really about meeting the person where they happen to be. And for some people, going online, reading about this, learning about it, they may be early enough in their own addictive disorder that simply self-educating turns out to be enough, and they don't need any more treatment than that. For others, they may find a 12-step group like Gamblers Anonymous, for example, which is the 12-step group specifically targeted at people with a gambling problem. Many people get relief from that program. It's very, very similar to Alcoholics Anonymous, which I think everyone has heard about. It's a voluntary program. You go when you want. There's no dues or fees or requirements for membership. Really, the only requirement is a desire to stop gambling. And for many people, simply going to those meetings regularly, sharing their personal story and hearing others share theirs is enough to keep them from going out and gambling and devastating their lives in that way. For others, they may need a higher level of treatment that could involve one-on-one therapy with someone who's a certified problem gambling counselor. And I want to mention the importance of trying to seek out someone who has training specifically in problem gambling. While there is a lot of overlap with treating the substance use disorders and gambling disorders, there really are some specific areas that require specialized training with regards to problem gambling that someone should achieve before trying to treat problem gamblers. For some individuals, that individual therapy may be enough. For others, they may need a higher level of care that can be provided in an intensive outpatient program. And again, many of our funded providers here in the state of Nevada provide intensive outpatient programs, which are typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the organization. Generally 4 or 5 days a week for 2.5 to 3 hours a day. They often require attendance at GA meetings as part of that process. And then at the end of that period, hopefully you've been given enough tools to continue your recovery beyond that. Most of those programs offer at least a year period of aftercare following moving on from those programs. And then for a very small percentage of individuals, they may need residential treatment. And we do have a couple organizations in the state of Nevada and northern Nevada and rural Nevada that combine residential treatment for problem gamblers for others who are suffering with substance use disorders. And that's by design to some extent. We have a lot of crossover between those disorders. In fact, about somewhere between 40 and 70% of individuals who are diagnosed with a gambling disorder will also be diagnosed with a co-occurring substance use disorder. The numbers coming the other direction aren't quite as high. About 10 to 15% of people who are diagnosed with a substance use disorder will also be diagnosed with a gambling disorder if they are screened for it. And that's another area of education that we're trying to continue to provide to other treatment providers who are treating only for substances, to make sure that they're offering some screening questions for those individuals to try and determine whether they might need a referral to someone who has a certification in problem gambling counseling. So while it's only 10 to 15%, that's not an insignificant number either. And everyone who develops an addictive disorder should be very aware that they're at much higher risk of developing an addictive disorder in another area than somebody from the general population. So want to get that message out as well.
Excellent. Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, through the Problem Gambling Fund in Nevada, there are many state-funded, partially state-funded treatment providers. They have access to state funding, so you can get assessed, get treatment for little to no money. They do have funds available for that. It might be you might be asked to provide a small copay, like with insurance, but there is funding for that. We have a resource locator on our website that can show all of that. I'll leave a link in the description. Thank you very much, Ted. I want to leave, I'll have a lot of links in the description for the GA website, our website, and everything like that. Appreciate talking to you again, and until next time, sir.
Absolutely. And if I could add one more thing before I forget, because I think I forgot to mention it, and that is that subsidized treatment is available not only to the individuals with the gambling problem, but it also is available to anyone who is affected by somebody else's gambling disorder. So if you are someone, either a family member or a friend or a coworker who's been affected by somebody else's gambling disorder, know that essentially free treatment is available to you through one of these resources that takes advantage of the State Problem Gambling Fund.
No, thank you. Great addition. And yep. So until next time, sir. And thank you everybody for tuning in. Goodbye.
Thanks, Aaron.